Tonight's presentation is entitled Ladies of the Lights, Michigan Women in the U.S. Lighthouse Service. The author of this book by the same name is Patricia Major. She is a former editor of Michigan History Magazine and a museum professional who's held administrative positions at institutions including the Henry Ford, as well as Mackinac State Historic Parks. Currently, she is the director of the Hamburg Township Historical Museum, just north of Ann Arbor. In addition to her same titled book, Ladies of the Lights, she has published Great Girls in Michigan History and Bold Boys in Michigan History with Wayne State University Press. And then she also has one more, which is 101 Things to Do in Ann Arbor Before You Die. So hopefully this year we all can make it there. I'd like to welcome Patricia. There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everyone in Zoom land. Well, I appreciate very much all of you signing up for my presentation. I wrote the book that this talk is based on 11 years ago, and I'm always surprised at the continuing interest in this topic, and and pleased I'm able to bring it to you. Carrie? Let me give you a little background first in terms of the chronology of lighthouse keeping as a profession. The very first lighthouse keeper in the U.S. was George Worthylake, and he served on Little Brewster Island, which is in Boston Harbor. And that position opened for him in 1716. It took almost 60 years for the first female keeper to come along, Hannah Thomas. She also served in Massachusetts at a lighthouse called Gwinnett Point. And she actually was a kind of a placeholder while her husband was serving in the Revolutionary War. I believe he died in that war, and then she ended up being the keeper, the official keeper. The first female on the Great Lakes, and I should note that this is the American side, I don't know the Canadian side history, was Rachel Wolcott. And she was at Marblehead in Ohio. If any of you know about the Michigan or Ohio women in lighthouse history, you certainly know her. She was one of the women who replaced a husband who died on the job, and I believe he had cholera. And so she began her service in 1832. And then it took another 17 years before we had the first one in Michigan, and her name was Catherine Shook. She began her service in 1849 at the end of her husband's life. He was a Civil War veteran, and he had died in a boating accident. So she took over in 1849. Next slide. There were some differences between male and female keepers that I uncovered in my research. And these are some of those areas. The first is the method of appointment. Generally, men were appointed to their positions in a number of ways. They could have been a seasoned sailor or a ship captain and been recommended for the position because of that. They could have been a Civil War veteran, was kind of common too, or a political appointee. Women, on the other hand, generally got there in one of two ways. One, as I've already mentioned, they succeeded a husband who died, and they were also in the, they would get the job as a result of applying for it in his absence. And then they would also be asked to be the lighthouse keeper when their husband was gone for a period of time. Uniform requirements were different between men and women. I'm sure you know the men's dress uniform for lighthouse keepers, navy blue double-breasted suit, pants, and a navy cap. The women had no uniform requirements. And I'm guessing that's because they didn't assume women would be serving long as a category of employee. So they just didn't put the time into designing a uniform for them. But most of the women served in the 19th century. So I think we can guess again that they were wearing long skirts, probably even a high-heeled boot, and climbing up and down the stairs in that sort of outfit. A little dangerous, I think, but that was what women wore, in any event, in any situation, were dresses at that time. Women were not allowed to serve on light ships. Light ships are essentially ships that are moored to a point that is a treacherous area in a body of water, and they would have a crew of 4 or 5 men. And I'm sure you can see how that might be a little challenging for one woman to be on an isolated ship like that. They also did not serve at isolated lights. They could serve on a coastline at a coastal lighthouse, but not on an island as either by themselves or as the chief keeper. Women were also not generally allowed to manage male assistants when they served at lighthouses that had the room and the need for more than one keeper. But there were a couple of exceptions, which I'll talk about. But their list of responsibilities was the same as those that were expected of men, with one exception, and this kind of harkens back to the dress discussion. If they happened to serve at a lighthouse that had that needed to be painted on the outside from the top of the tower to the bottom, that was a job that was done on a bosun's chair, where they'd basically be, lowered up and down in a pulley system. And that was thought to be rather unladylike for a woman in skirts to be doing that. So women were allowed to hire to bring someone else in to do the painting. And then in the case of salary, surprisingly, they were paid exactly the same amount. Men and women were, one wasn't favored over the other. Although I'm sure many of you who know lighthouse history know that they were not paid well in general. But all the way back in Michigan to Catherine Shook in the 1840s, they were paid the same. Next. In Michigan, the statistics for ladies of the lights include these points. They served for a span of 105 years, from 1849 to 1954. And there were 52 known female lighthouse keepers and assistant keepers, which is more than any other state in the Union. And that is likely tied to Michigan having the most lighthouses of any state in the Union. And when I put the word known in there, that was actually very, there's a good point for that, because sometimes when you look through the records of who served at what lighthouses, they might just have a first initial and then their last name. Or they might have a name like Renee that could be spelled differently for men and women, but might be misinterpreted. So we don't really know for certain without going back through some serious records at the National Archives to find out if all of the women we know were all of the women there were. And the Michigan women served at 42 different lighthouses on Lake Huron, Michigan, and Superior, as well as the Detroit River. They did not serve in Lake Erie. Next. Michigan women were generally very long-serving employees, an average of 5.5 years, which was better than men. Some young men came into the profession and decided it wasn't the life for them, and that sort of lowered the number of years in average that male lighthouse keepers would serve. So women served 5.5 years average, and 9 women served 10 years or more. And as I mentioned, most succeeded a deceased husband or filled in for an absent husband during wartime. One of the things I think is interesting about these women in this particular region is that several of the female keepers were part of families that did this. It was really their family business, with mothers, fathers, siblings, children, sometimes 3 generations worth all involved in the profession. Next. The first lady of the light, as I mentioned, is Catherine Shook. Her life was from 1810 to 1860, and she served at Pointe Aux Barques. That's at the tip of the thumb in Michigan, at the entry to the Saginaw Bay. And she took over in 1849 after her keeper husband drowned in Lake Huron. She also raised 8 children alone in the wilderness of the thumb at that time, which was a pretty unpopulated, rugged area. And I'm sure some of those children helped her, but still to be in an isolated light like that by yourself, as far as having the responsibility, must have been a daunting task. Her family was soon, after the death of Peter Shook, they were soon burned out of their cottage. And it turned out that it wasn't any fault of anyone who lived there. It was actually a faulty chimney design. But they were left with having to pull together a lean-to from the lumber that they could salvage from the burned cottage. And just as a sign of the times, Catherine was not allowed to sign for the materials used to build the second cottage. Her oldest son actually had to do that. She lasted about 2 years at that position, and I suppose that's not surprising, again, given that it was a very remote site to be located. And she moved on from there. One of the interesting things about Catherine, in addition to these points, is that her 8 children went on to have many children and many children and many children. And it's not an uncommon situation for me when I'm speaking about the book in person, that somebody will raise their hand and say, I'm part of the Shook family. I'm related to them too. So that's just kind of a fun aside that I learned while I was doing the research. We don't have a photo of Catherine because of her early life. But I do have photos of the next few women I'm going to focus on. Next. This is a photo of Anna Garrity, and she and her mother were the only 2 Michigan women who were related that served in the lighthouse service. Her mother was the assistant to her father, and they also had 3 brothers. There were 3 children, 3 sons, in addition to Mary, who served as lighthouse keepers in Lake Huron, up in the Presqu'île area. And altogether, they served a combined 184 years, which is an amazing legacy. And Anna was the second longest serving woman in Michigan at 23 years. Next. I call this the persevering lady of the light. This is Julia Braun, later Julia Braun Way. And she helped her invalid husband. He was a Civil War veteran who had had an injury until his death, and then succeeded him. And she served at the Saginaw River Light, my hometown of Bay City, Michigan. Her sort of claim to fame during her tenure was that she oversaw construction of the existing lighthouse. She served as keeper after her husband died until she remarried, and then her husband was automatically promoted to that position. She then assisted him until 1882, when her position was abolished. And then later, a few months later, they reinstated the job and gave it to a man. But there must have been something underfoot in the lighthouse service at that point, because the same thing happened in the Garrity family, where the mother, her position was abolished in 1882. I love this photograph because I think it really underscores what kind of the challenge, the physical challenge of being a female keeper. You can only imagine what she looked like when she came with her husband, and they were first on the scene at the Saginaw River Lighthouse. In this photo, to me, she looks pretty haggard. It wasn't a job where you needed to get extra exercise outside of your duties. Next. This is Elizabeth Whitney Williams, and she is Michigan's longest serving Lady of the Light for 41 years total at 2 separate lights. And her husband was the keeper at Beaver Island Harbor Light in Lake Michigan, and he drowned trying to save people who were involved in a shipwreck. So she took over for him and served on her own there for an additional 12 years. She later remarried and requested a transfer to a new light, the Little Traverse Light, also on Lake Michigan, and served there for an additional 29 years. She is kind of our rock star of female keepers in Michigan, and not just here, but nationally. If you've ever seen the books about, can't even think of it, women who served, I think is the title, mother-daughter authors of books about nationwide women who served with distinction, and she's in that book. She's had a play written about her, she's had a children's book written about her, and she also wrote a book, an autobiography of her experience in her positions. It's an interesting book to read, both from the standpoint of lighthouse history, but she talks about life on an island, and she happened to be born on Mackinac Island and then obviously ended up on Beaver Island, where she lived as a child during the period when there was a Mormon colony there. And that was a very challenging time for the non-Mormons on the island, and they were eventually asked to leave and had to move to the mainland until their leader was killed by one of their own, and then they moved back. So it's an interesting book to kind of read that history too, about a religious group that took over an island, and but she loved being on an island, and that's why she stayed and served at 2 separate lights. Okay, next. There were some reluctant ladies of the lights. There was a lighthouse keeper named Gus Gramer who served at the Ecorse Range Light in the Detroit River. And he was quite an adventurer. He had been a sailor, he had been a whaler, he had been shipwrecked, he had traveled the 7 seas. And for whatever reason, he took this position at the Ecorse Range Light in, inland. Must have seemed quite a come down, at least in terms of the adventure that he craved. So at one point he left Lucy. She had just given birth to a child, left her, and went off to fight in the Spanish-American War. And she was not very happy about that, as you might expect. Probably for her sake, the good thing is it was a fairly short war. And so she was not happy even when he came back. Let me read a little bit from the book for an account of what happened then. She actually filed for divorce, and he went to the Detroit Tribune to argue his case in the newspaper. And so that went back and forth between newspaper reporters. Let me see here. The newspaper reported how Gus called upon his wife the other night and urged her to come back with the children and live with him, but she demurred. And after acknowledging how good he had been to her, she fell on her knees, Gus says, and between her sobs confessed that she really preferred a roomer of the Gramers, although he was not as handsome. End quote. Gramer then claimed to have called his old friend in, made the man kneel beside his wife, and placed Lucy's hand in that of the other person. Lucy, he is reported to have said, be good to the children. Charlie, be good to Lucy, as she has been a good wife to me. And then he told the reporter that he concluded the meeting by taking Lucy and Charlie out for ice cream sundaes. Unfortunately for Gus, Mrs. Gramer disputed his account, particularly the part about falling on her knees. And this is what she said: if Gus was half as good as Charlie, it would be better for him, and there probably would never have been any trouble between us. When he says that I'm going to marry another man as soon as I get divorced, he is drawing on his imagination. There is no truth in it, and I never fell down on my knees to Gus and confessed anything. End quote. Though Gus had agreed to give Lucy custody of their children, she apparently didn't trust him to keep his word. She told the paper that she was going to keep a sharp lookout to see that he didn't get any legal advantage when she was not looking. Gus eventually became a single lighthouse keeper, a divorced lighthouse keeper, of course, and quickly married again, this time to a woman named Mary, and her name appears as an acting keeper in Ecorse for 2 weeks in 1906. So that was one of the more sensational stories about Ladies of the Lights, Lucy Gramer and Gus. Probably, I think there weren't any of the other accounts that I uncovered where husbands and wives fought in the newspaper in such a public way. Next. In Michigan, this was our last Lady of the Light. Her name was Frances Rory Johnson, and she was a native of Pontiac, an inland town, but she had gone over to Lake Michigan in her youth to have a weekend of fun with some friends of hers. She was walking along the shore at the White River Lighthouse, which is near Muskegon, Whitehall, that area. And she met this man, and he told her he was a lighthouse keeper. And they took a fancy to each other, as they would say in that day. And they met a few more times. She came back from Pontiac to visit with him, and they eventually got married. So she became the lighthouse keeper assistant. It was like the Gramers. It was not a very pleasant marriage. And here's what she had to say about her husband. I actually had the opportunity to interview Frances, which was amazing. I mean, it was just like, a touching the past kind of experience. She was a very feisty lady and very forthcoming with her opinions. And this was her opinion of what it was like to be the assistant to her husband. So I say to her, let's go backwards for a minute. You were Leo's assistant in lighthouse keeping when you were married. You assisted him. And he said, assisted him? He didn't do anything. He liked to fish and hunt and stuff like that. And that's what he did. He found out that he could do that and I could do all the work. So I, of course, fixed the meals, did the dishes, waxed the floors. And then after I was done with all that, I had to keep the light clean every day. So it didn't turn out to be the partnership that she had hoped. And he actually decided he wanted to leave there and move to a lighthouse in the Upper Peninsula. She was not interested in that. So they divorced, and he went up to the UP, and she went back to Pontiac. But she really loved the life, and she loved being on Lake Michigan, and she missed it. So she petitioned the Lighthouse Service to be allowed to come back and be the keeper again. And she was our only female in the Coast Guard era. She ended her career as a Coast Guard employee, not a service person, but a Coast Guard employee. And she, just reveled in that life. And she was very well known, especially to the cottagers that were around that lighthouse. Um, she, at the White River Light, that was essentially a canal that led to White Lake. And there were not a series of shipwrecks around there. It was really more of a pleasure boating area. So she didn't really have to do anything that would, on the scale of some of the lighthouse keepers that we know of. But what she did do was she saved a number of lives because people came to Lake Michigan and just were not aware enough of the riptides and how strong they could be. So she would be, up in the tower cleaning the glass or something like that. And she would hear and see someone crying out from the water and would tear down the stairs and out the door across the sand and leap into the water and save them. And one of the stories she told me that that really had imprinted itself in her memory was there was a lady who was heavy set, and Frances was not. She was about 5 feet tall and maybe 100 pounds. This woman had indeed gotten caught in a riptide, was having trouble getting out of it. When Frances reached her, the woman was so panicked that she just did not appreciate that she was getting saved. And so she started to drag them both down with her flailing. So Frances reached back and socked her in the jaw. And that stopped the woman from doing that. And they both made it to shore safely. And afterwards, the woman asked her, "Why did you ever do that to me?" And she said, "Because if I hadn't, we both would have gone down." So that was part and parcel of her feistiness, her feisty personality. But she did that repeatedly. There were a lot of those situations that came her way. As I mentioned, I interviewed her and I asked her at that time if she would come to a museum that I worked at, the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and speak with us. And she came, and she was really thrilled to share her stories. And so were the people who were there to listen. But what she was most thrilled about was that she had actually been a contestant on the game show, What's Your Line? Or What's My Line? And she had fooled them. And the closest they could come was that maybe she worked in the cereal business down in Battle Creek. So she got her $50 for having been on the show, and she had a train ticket back and forth, and they showed her a good time in New York City. And that was the only real vacation that she took while she was in service at that lighthouse. So quite a character. Next. There were some tragic stories involving the women in Michigan that served as lighthouse keepers. This is a picture of Julia Sheridan. The Sheridans were another one of those lighthouse keeping families. In this case, they were in Lake Michigan. And she assisted her husband on South Manitou Island. She had, the two of them had 5 children, and one was still a toddler. When they left the lighthouse and went to the mainland to do some shopping with a friend, on their way back, they were capsized. The friend survives, but Julia, her husband, and the toddler that they took with them all drowned. And to make the story even sadder, the 4 children are stranded on the island, not knowing what happened, and waiting day after day for their parents to come back. Amazingly, one of those children grew up to be a lighthouse keeper. The next person that had a tragic story in her service was Mary Terry. She served in Escanaba. And the Escanaba Lighthouse, which has been rebuilt from the one that was there in her time, is located out on a point. And it's very close to town, but it's not so close that you might notice a disturbance there. And one night there was a fire at the lighthouse, and she, for whatever reason, was found inside, her body burned, and of course she had died in that experience. But there was quite a question of what caused her death, why she didn't leave the lighthouse. And there was an official inquiry called. Um, she happened to be a woman who had saved all of her meager salary, and she owned or purchased along the way in her career some lots of land, and was known to have a tidy sum of money. So the thought was that perhaps someone had come out to rob her, and maybe there had been something, a scuffle or whatever, or maybe he had intended to kill her. But that was why she didn't leave the lighthouse when he set it on fire. So it was a very sad story in her case, and one that's still a bit of a mystery as to what happened. They never were able to find anyone who was involved in any kind of crime. They only knew that the door looked like it had been forced open. And then the last of the tragic stories that I want to share tonight was about Anna Garrity, again, the member of the Garrity family from Lake Huron. She grew up in the lighthouse, so her father was the keeper, her mother was the assistant, and she and her brothers lived there too. But she had been assaulted by one of the assistants that her father had. And as you know, the lighthouse keepers were required to keep logs of the weather, of traffic that sailed by, visitors and that sort of thing, and any anomalies, anything unusual that happened at the lighthouse. So this is what her father had written in his logbook for June 19, 1889. My assistant, no name given, is now in the county jail. The sheriff arrested him with a criminal warrant for the crime of rape on my daughter and threatened her life and tried to choke her. The assistant obtained a hearing before a justice and was bound over to the term of circuit court, which will be on October 9th. Following journalistic practice of the day, Anna was named in the newspaper report. The Presque County Advance described her as a beautiful young lady of 17 summers who comes from a most highly respected family. And the assistant was tried for his crime in nearby Rogers City, but the results of that trial were in records that were destroyed by a fire, as was common in that day. However, lighthouse records show that he was removed from his position. So I'm assuming he did serve some time for that. But amazingly, Anna grew up and decided she still wanted to be in that profession, and she served for much of her career alone in her lighthouse. Next. And there were triumphs along the way. This is a picture of Anastasia Truckee, and she served at the Marquette Harbor Light in the Upper Peninsula. And her term of service was during the Civil War. Her husband, who had been the keeper at that time, actually assembled a regiment to serve in the Civil War, and they left for the South. And she was granted the opportunity to serve in his stead. And in between the two of them, they really kind of gave their time and their energy to the Civil War. And he was actually on the battlefield. He was commander of troops on the battlefield. But she was, in charge of the lighthouse that was critical to the war effort, because that was the harbor there is where the iron ore was being brought to be loaded onto ships to take out to factories so that it could be smelted and turned into things like cannonballs and railroad spikes. So, in a way, they both served very honorably in the Civil War from two different points. I mentioned already that Elizabeth Whitney was a keeper at Little Traverse Light in her second stint as a lighthouse keeper, and that was a new light. She was the first one to serve there, and that was regarded as an honor in the lighthouse community. And then Jane Enos, who served down in St. Joseph, and Anna Garrity managed male assistants. Anna did that later in her career. So that was, again, a rare opportunity for a woman to have the opportunity to manage men. Next. Again, in keeping with the times in which most of these women served in the 1900s, there were a number of lighthouse keepers and assistant lighthouse keepers who were mothers of huge families. This is a picture of Mary Corgan. She married into another lighthouse keeping family that served in Lake Superior. And at the first assigned light that she and her husband moved to, she was pregnant. And she successfully gave birth in the boat that was taking her to the mainland to deliver. And this is what her husband wrote in his lighthouse log about that event. This is July 15, 1875. Principal keeper started 8 p.m. in the station boat with wife for Copper Harbor, a distance of 14 miles, with anticipation of increase soon upon arriving. When 1.5 miles east of Horseshoe Harbor, Mrs. Corgan gave birth to a rollicking boy. All things lovely, had everything comfortable aboard. The sea was a dead calm. I like the way he works in the weather report. That's the end of his account. But after the child was delivered, there was no need to seek help in Copper Harbor. So the craft was turned around and they sailed back to the lighthouse with their new resident. And his parents named him James. James later went on to be a warden at the Marquette State Prison, but one of her other children actually became a lighthouse keeper like his parents. So it's another continuation of that legacy family. But the sort of the grande dame of mothers, if you will, was a keeper at Squaw Point, was another Escanaba area lighthouse keeper. And her name was Catherine Marvin, and she had 10 children. It was not uncommon for women to have 6 to 8 children across the state. And many of those women relied on their kids, as did many of the fathers when they were the head keeper, relied on the children to help with tasks big and small. And you probably know that the lighthouse service would visit the lighthouses on at least a quarterly basis to deliver supplies, but also to inspect the lighthouse stations. And cleanliness was next to godliness in their minds, so there was a lot of cleaning that needed to be done, and that was certainly a task that younger children could do. Next. In some cases, in just a few cases, we know what happened to women after they left service in the lighthouse, with the lighthouse. None of the Michigan women died while being a keeper. And some were young when they left for whatever reason. This picture is the seated person is Carolyn Lidigot Antaya. And I don't know if her name resonates with anyone out there listening, but Lidigot is Henry Ford's mother's maiden name. So this woman was Henry Ford's aunt. She married Barney Lidigot, who was a Civil War veteran and really in bad health when he took the job in a Detroit River lighthouse, excuse me. So Carolyn did most of the work until he passed, and then she became lighthouse keeper. And she served without an assistant, as you know, with 2 boys at that time. And then she met a man who lived in the Port Huron area, and he owned a fishery. They got married, but she stayed at the lighthouse in the river. And that went on until they had a child. And then she decided she didn't want to, raise her third child away from it was a daughter, away from the daughter's father and brothers. So they all met and joined up back in Port Huron. So she left her position as a result of that. Frances Rory Johnson, I mentioned earlier, was serving at the White River Light. She married a man named Johnson after she divorced Leo Rory, and she started a second career. She had some business training back in Pontiac when she was a young woman, and she kind of fell back into that in a number of industries in the Muskegon area, where she served in office management and retired, at 65 after having, 2 full careers really in her life. And then we know other women remarried and changed names or moved away even from the state. But with the change of names, particularly, we've really lost track of where many of them have gone to, which is a shame. And if I had more time, I could follow up on that. But it's much easier to trace the path of a male keeper than a female keeper. Next. As I mentioned here, I had that opportunity to interview Frances and also to bring her to the museum I was working at, where she talks to us. And she really was our last living link, and she passed away in 2011. Her self-described claim to fame was that opportunity she had on What's My Line? And she really kind of she really thoroughly enjoyed her lighthouse keeping career, but she didn't realize quite how special she was in that. And when I last talked to her, I asked her about that. And this is what she had to say. I asked her, "Do you think of yourself as a pioneer?" And she said, "No, not really," with a laugh. And I said, "Because you were." And she said, "Well, I sure enjoyed it, whatever I was." Next. That's it. That's the end of my formal presentation. Obviously, with the book, I go into a description of many more women, about 16 women that we have really strong accounts of their service. And in other cases, we don't have much information. And partly that's because they might have served very temporarily, or because they, frankly, didn't do anything wrong and had, a fairly smooth sailing, if you will. So anyway, more of the accounts of other women are in my book, as well as my full interview with Frances Rory Johnson.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. I will tell you, we've had quite a few questions come in while you were speaking, so I hope you can give us a little bit more time to kind of follow up with some of these.
Sure.
This one comes from Sophie Stewart. In your research, do you know of any other job this early in American history where women and men were paid the same wage? Okay, because Sophie mentioned she used to work at a lighthouse and often got this question from patron, but was never able to find any reference to it.
I can only assume that it was, it was a federal job, so that was very distinctive, and that when they started to allow women to serve, they really didn't expect they would do that for long. I mean, I think they thought that there would be a steady stream of men interested in the appointments, and that it would be easier to replace men on a temporary basis. So that's my assumption, that they just gave them the same amount because they didn't want to deal with the record keeping of having different levels of pay for the same positions.
Okay. This is one of those, and I'm not sure if you're going to have that right off the hand, but I thought I would ask. Robert Young was asking, in today's dollars, the salaries numbers that you were talking about early on, what would that be in today's
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I know that Frances, who was the last female to be a lighthouse keeper in Michigan, when she left in 1945, she was making $1,000 a year. I don't know what that translates into, but it was not living large, especially if you had a big family.
Right. Here's something, and I'm actually glad somebody asked this question, because I was kind of wondering it too. You talked a lot about how Frances Johnson, went out and saved a bunch of lives. Do you know how many people she saved? And the asker Laurel was also, like, you seem very enthusiastic about her. And have you ever thought about writing a biography of her?
No, I have not. I thought about that. I don't know how many she saved, and I'm not even sure she knew how many she saved. Again, it was just sort of her personality. It's like, oh yeah, I saved some people, kind of thing. Particularly since she didn't do this with any kind of boat. She would just swim out to these people and get them. So I'm sorry I don't know that answer, but she was quite a character and very well known in her area. Her death was greatly mourned.
As somebody who spends time in the waters of the Great Lakes, that's impressive just in and of itself. Here's Abigail Johnson. Again, I probably know the answer to this, but I would like you to answer it. Since they often succeeded a husband, could it be assumed that some of the women lighthouse keepers had actually been performing the duties of lighthouse keeper for longer than that, or at least co-performing with their husbands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excuse me. In fact, many of them did have the official title assistant keeper to their husbands, and in which case they received pay as well as their husband. Some were just a little bit more casual in the way they were viewed by the lighthouse service. But yes, I'm sure that, and as I mentioned, some of these men were Civil War veterans. And so they physically needed the assistance to, maybe, transport the oil up the stairs kind of thing. So yes, yeah. And I do address that in my book too, that, it's not just the primary keepers, not just women serving as primary keepers, but many as assistants too.
Right. And just because you referenced it, I'm going to go ahead and reference it. Your book is of the same title, this Ladies of the Light. Pardon me, I always forget the subtitle. I'm looking at Michigan Women in the U.S. Lighthouse Service. If you guys are interested in this book, because I got to tell you, I need to reread it again now after listening to you read some of those passages. It is for sale on our website, nmglstore.org. So if you did not buy a copy tonight with your ticket to the webinar, you can still go on and purchase one there.
Could I make a point? Yep. The mother-daughter duo of authors who have written about women nationwide in the service, their names are Mary Louise Clifford and J. Candace Clifford, and the book is Women Who Kept the Lights: An Illustrated History of Female Lighthouse Keepers. So that's a very entertaining book. There was a woman who was Michigan born who served out in California, and she had a very colorful life, and I mentioned her in my book. But I would say that the Cliffords focus on women with the exception of obviously Elizabeth Whitney Williams, they focus on women on the coasts, either, generally either California or somewhere in the South. So,
as I often like to say in mine, the Great Lakes are sort of the redheaded step cousin that tends to get forgotten by a lot of history and researchers. We've got a couple more here if you've got a little bit more time. From Rory, there's a genre of story about lighthouse keepers who go mad due perhaps to the isolation the job entails. Did you research and cover any women who were driven mad during their service?
I can think of a woman in the Upper Peninsula who was at a particularly remote light with her husband, and apparently a bear came and ate a child. I mean, it was, a terrible story. And she was, just distraught, could not be comforted by that. There's a famous story also in the Upper Peninsula about a man who went insane, and two assistants sort of ganged up on their keeper, on their boss, and there was a death in that in that situation. And it was, yeah, thought to be sort of a, just too much time alone, not enough to do kind of thing. There's a movie I actually just made like last year. I remember watching it, and it had Robert Pattinson, who was in those Twilight books. He's in it with Willem Dafoe, and that's a story about, the
Yes.
one or both of those lighthouse keepers. I don't want to, spoil the surprise, going mad. So yeah, it certainly on those isolated lights where you weren't connected to the mainland, that could certainly happen. It was also a lot easier if you had, if you were connected to the connected to the mainland, to raise a family. You could send your kids to the school in Marquette. That was the thing that they could do. The school was there, blocks away, from the lighthouse.
Right.
When women were serving at lights with their husbands, as a couple, and they had a lot of kids, they would obviously homeschool them in the way that we would think of it today, with help from the lighthouse service, who would periodically deliver a box of books, reference books, like atlases and, history of, Asia or whatever, newspapers, the Bible. And that was, the way that they were able to educate their children. So.
I will say I have several viewers who have gone on Google, and just for all of our own edification, $1,000 in 1945 is today worth about $14,500. So not a lot.
Yeah.
Here's a question
that's
from
minimum
John.
wage. Yeah.
During the lake's frozen period, shipping probably came to a stop. Yes. What would have been the responsibilities of the lighthouse keepers during this time, and were they expected to still be at the post? What did the women do to keep themselves occupied, and what did they do for their cultural or societal enrichment?
They generally left the lights that were on islands in the winter, because of, there was nothing to do, and it was even more isolating to be there. So they would, leave for about a 3-month period. There's nobody going by. We didn't have to save anybody. There's no danger of shipwrecks, and so why be out there? And obviously weather would be even worse on an island than it would be on the mainland. So yes, thankfully they didn't have to do that. And they would take that opportunity to obviously be with family and travel and whatever. Particularly because the other 9 months of the year they really were not allowed to leave unless they had a certified substitute to man the light when they were not there. So yeah, that's how they handled that. Yes, thankfully it was not at least in this part of the country, it was not a 12-month-a-year job.
Again, considering that you and I both live in this area, and I would not want to be out there doing that on days like the last week and a half or so. Mm-hmm. Carolyn asks, is it considered a privilege to be a keeper, or did they pretty much hire anyone? Meaning, and the secondary to that, did any of the women that were hired get selected over a man?
No, because all the women in Michigan, either got there because a husband had died, or they had, were a temporary fill-in, whether it was 6 months like the Spanish-American War, or a couple of years like the Civil War. But yeah, it was not something that was just, we'll take anybody. And the men had rigid, requirements. Like I said, they, generally had some sort of sailing experience, or they were, a naval, they were a seaman, in the Navy. And they generally were appointed. It was almost a political type of appointment, federal job. So it was, it was regarded as a respected profession for men or women. But so there weren't any women that were picked over men, because there weren't any women that were, vying for a job against a man.
Okay, I understand. Turning just a little bit more to the research side of some of the work that you've done, Megan was wanting to know, do you know of any repositories that have maybe digitized lighthouse logbooks, basically places where we could go to maybe research some of these logbooks that you're talking about online?
Well, when I wrote the book 11 years ago, no. um, and I relied on both the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association website, which is very, Terry Peppers did a great job when he assembled um, sort of a sketch of each lighthouse and the significant keepers. And then he would also have a list, of those keepers throughout the history of the light. Those were generally based on a couple's research, and they had done that lake by lake, and they had gone to the National Archives direct and just got those records. Let me find their names here. I'm trying to think what they're.
So most of the lighthouse logs and records are all part of the National Archives then. Okay. But yeah, go ahead and find those names.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That would be easier than.
While you're looking for that real quick, I will say we have a lot of. Oh, go ahead then.
It was Phyllis and Thomas Tagg, T-A-G.
Okay.
And they had published a series of books on the lighthouse keepers of each Great Lake.
Okay.
And that really is more statistical, name, date that the person came on into service, when they left, reason why. And so Terry used that, I know, in the preparation of his books. And I think Fred Stonehouse, who's also done a lot of work about keepers history, also used those books, which now I do hope are digitized somewhere. But I was able to locate them. I live in Ann Arbor, and so I was able to locate them at places like the Bentley Historical Library here associated with U of M.
Okay. So I want to say one more thing, and then I'll give us one more question, which is there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I apologize if we didn't get to yours. I'm going to try and copy some of them off. And if, Patricia, if you have some time over the next couple of days, maybe you can type out a few quick answers to some of them. And what I will do is email them out to all of you, what Patricia's able to answer. But I want to ask this one because I'm the same kind of busybody, nosy person. Did the keepers' assistants, wives, children all live together in the lighthouse or nearby?
Well, in some designs, the cottage, the tower is part of the cottage, whether it's to the side of it, but connected by a walkway, or whether it's just really built into the building itself. So they're, yes, very close. In a couple of others, very early ones, it was a separate building, but I think they realized early on in Michigan that it would be best if there was, the person didn't have to leave, go outside to then get into the tower and go up. And they, but like I said, it kind of depended upon the designs. And there were a number of architects who focused on lighthouses, and sometimes their patterns repeated. The schoolhouse design is kind of a common one with the tower in the center, the conical towers of, some of the forgetting the name of that architect. Boy, see, 11 years, I'm losing the memory of it. Anyway, he was a Civil War general who went on to design lighthouses. So yeah, but they did all live together, and like I said, that was much easier on the mainland to do that. Really could just walk out and go somewhere. If you were in the Detroit River, it wasn't bad because you had a short boat ride over to the mainland. Those isolated islands were much trickier, and I do know that some children stayed on the mainland, with another family or whatever. At their parents' discretion. Sometimes they wanted all the kids with them, and sometimes it was like, it'll just be easier if we do this ourselves and you guys go to school. So,
right. So I think we are going to wrap up for tonight. I will say we also had one viewer who mentioned that she found the video of Frances from What's My Line and sent me the YouTube link. So I will also include that in our wrap up email that I send out with some of our stuff, because I got to be honest, I want to watch that for darn sure. I do want to say thank you to you, Patricia. For those of you that did pre-order the book, Ladies of the Lights, we had more orders than we expected, which is phenomenal. We're going to ship the first set out this week, and we are placing another order tomorrow morning for the rest of the book. So if you are still interested in purchasing the book, please buy it online through our website, nmglstore.org, and you can get into that order that we're going to place tomorrow. So it may take 2 weeks, but you all will get your books within the next 2 weeks. Our next lecture in our spring series, our concluding lecture for our spring series is in 3 weeks on March 17th by Jerry Kuntz. He's the author of Heroic Age of Diving, America's Underwater Pioneers and the Great Wrecks of Lake Erie. And we'll be presenting on that topic. And you can sign up the same way you signed up here through Eventbrite, and we will be promoting that as well. So you will get lots of notifications on it. Please don't forget, if you guys are not a member, now's a great time to join. You can join at nmgl.org/membership. And last of all, thank you again, Patricia, for your time and expertise tonight. It's really been a lot of fun. And to all of you watching, thank you for being here with us tonight. Please stay safe and healthy. And we hope we will see you guys again in 3 weeks. Have a good night.
Thank you all.